Okay, so like everyone's talking about this Gaza ceasefire, right?
Yeah.
It's a big deal, but it's also like a really complicated story, so we're going to try to break it down.
Yeah, definitely.
We're talking more than 15 months of conflict between Israel and Hamas.
Right.
Tragic losses on both sides.
Yeah, absolutely.
Over 1,200 Israelis and 46,700 Palestinians have lost their lives.
It's heartbreaking.
And this ceasefire, set to start January 19th, 2025,
Yeah.
it could be a turning point, but we need to understand how we even got here.
Right. We have to look at the bigger picture.
So to really understand this, we need to like rewind a bit.
Absolutely.
Go back to the beginning.
This isn't just some, isolated event.
Yeah.
It's part of this long and complex history.
Mhm.
Things really sort of exploded back in October 2023
Yeah.
when Hamas launched that surprise attack on Israel.
Right.
About 1,200 Israelis were killed and
Right.
over 250 taken hostage.
And then Israel responded with that huge military operation in Gaza.
Yeah, that was the turning point where things just escalated dramatically.
And that's what led to the humanitarian crisis we're seeing now. Exactly. The scale of it's just hard to even grasp.
Yeah, it's almost like trying to imagine an entire city, just flattened,
Wow.
people living in whatever shelter they can find,
Yeah.
struggling for the most basic necessities.
So this ceasefire is aiming to bring some relief.
Yeah.
But you said earlier it's a delicate dance.
Yeah.
There are a lot of moving parts here.
Exactly. A lot of moving parts.
So walk us through it.
Okay.
This ceasefire agreement, it's a 3-phase plan, right?
Yes. 3 phases, each one designed to kind of tackle a different piece of the puzzle.
Okay.
The first phase focuses on the immediate needs, like getting those 33 hostages back to their families.
The ones who've been held for over 40 days?
Yeah, over 42 days.
Wow.
And then also getting humanitarian aid flowing into Gaza.
It's got to be such a relief for those families.
Oh, absolutely. Imagine finally knowing your loved ones are coming home.
Yeah, can't even imagine.
Right.
But even getting the aid into Gaza, it's not simple, is it?
No, it's incredibly complex.
Yeah.
It's not just about having the supplies. It's about ensuring they actually reach the people who need them most
Right.
safely and efficiently.
So phase 1 is like putting out the immediate fires.
Exactly.
Okay, but phase 2, things start to get a little more political, right?
Yeah. Phase 2 is where we start wading into those kind of murky political waters.
Okay.
It involves negotiating the release of the remaining hostages.
Which I imagine is not going to be easy.
No, not at all.
Yeah,
And then there's the phased withdrawal of Israeli troops from Gaza,
right.
which is a major sticking point.
Yeah, I can imagine that pulling troops out always raises security concerns.
For sure.
Are there people within Israel who are pushing back against this part of the deal?
Oh, absolutely. The agreement is getting mixed reactions in Israel.
Okay.
Some of the hardliners in the Israeli government, they're really against relinquishing control over Gaza.
Yeah.
They're worried about what might happen if Israel steps back.
So even if this ceasefire gets off the ground, you're saying that Israeli politics could be a major roadblock.
It could definitely derail the whole thing.
So let's say it survives that.
Okay.
Phase 3.
Yeah.
This is about rebuilding and creating a new future for Gaza.
Right.
That sounds like a monumental task.
It is. Phase 3 is where the real long-term work begins.
Yeah.
You're talking about rebuilding homes, schools, hospitals, the entire infrastructure.
Wow.
And it's not just about the bricks and mortar.
Right.
It's about establishing a new governance structure for Gaza.
Which is arguably even more complex.
Oh, much more complex.
You mentioned the international community's role in all of this.
Yes.
But honestly, haven't we seen this story before?
What do you mean?
Money pours in, but corruption siphons it off.
Right.
And nothing really changes for the people on the ground.
Yeah.
Am I being too cynical?
I mean, it's a valid concern. We've seen it happen before, right?
Yeah.
Where the aid money doesn't reach the people who need it. Accountability and transparency are going to be so crucial in this rebuilding process.
Yeah, for sure.
We have to make sure that the funds are used effectively.
Right.
And that corruption is tackled head on.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we're just setting ourselves up for failure.
You feel like this whole ceasefire is walking this like tightrope,
Yeah.
over all these challenges.
It is a very delicate situation.
I hear you saying this is a chance for peace,
It is.
but I also hear that hesitation in your voice.
Yeah.
Is there a part of you that thinks this is just like setting the stage for another round of fighting?
I mean, I'd be lying if I said I wasn't worried about that.
Right.
This region has a long history of conflict.
Yeah.
Mistrust runs deep on both sides.
Right.
We can't ignore that.
So then how do we even begin to build lasting peace?
Well, it requires a fundamental shift
Yep.
in attitudes, a commitment to dialogue and compromise.
Okay, so let's talk about those commitments then.
Okay.
It's not just about Israel and Hamas, is it?
No, it's not.
This ceasefire has implications for the entire region
Absolutely.
and even the world.
This conflict has been a major source of instability in the Middle East for way too long.
It really has.
It's a powder keg,
Yeah.
and the ripples of this ceasefire will be felt far beyond Gaza's borders.
And then on top of all of that, we have the new Trump administration coming in.
Right.
Feels like that just adds even more unknowns to the equation.
It does. The new administration's stance on this conflict.
Right.
It's a bit of a wild card right now.
Totally.
We don't know, will they support this agreement?
Yeah.
How will this impact U.S. involvement in the region?
Right.
These are all questions we don't have answers to yet.
So we've got this whole layer of international intrigue going on.
Exactly.
On top of everything else, it's like a geopolitical thriller unfolding in real time.
That's a good way to put it.
So we've talked about the international implications, but what about regional stability?
Right. Well, this ceasefire could be the first step,
Yeah.
Towards a broader peace process in the Middle East.
That would be incredible.
It would, but it could also just be a temporary pause.
Right before more conflict.
Exactly. It all hinges on whether both sides are truly committed.
Yeah, to finding a way to coexist.
Exactly.
But how do you build that trust?
That's the question, isn't it?
Yeah, when there's been so much bloodshed.
It's one of the toughest challenges for sure.
Yeah.
But I think it starts with acknowledging the pain and suffering
Okay.
on both sides.
Right.
It starts with a willingness to listen to each other's stories.
And to understand each other's fears.
Exactly. It's a long and difficult process.
It sounds like it.
But it's the only path to genuine reconciliation.
You've painted a pretty sobering picture here.
Yeah.
But are there any reasons to be optimistic?
Well, I think the fact that both sides even agreed to this ceasefire,
Okay.
despite all the pressure and the mistrust,
Yeah.
that's a sign that they're at least willing to try.
Okay.
It's a glimmer of hope, a recognition that the status quo just isn't sustainable anymore.
So that's something, I guess.
It is something.
A sliver of hope in a really dark situation.
Yeah.
But even if this ceasefire holds,
Right.
the real work is just beginning.
Exactly. This is a marathon, not a sprint.
Yeah.
Building lasting peace requires patience, persistence.
And a willingness to challenge long-held assumptions.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's talk about those assumptions then.
Okay.
What are some things we need to be watching for as this ceasefire unfolds?
Right. Well, for starters,
Yeah.
we need to see if the Israeli cabinet even approves this deal.
Right, you said there's some strong opposition within the government.
There is from those hardliners who are worried about security.
Right. And if it doesn't get through the cabinet,
Then that's a major blow right out of the gate.
right from the very beginning.
Exactly. And even if it does get approved,
Okay.
actually implementing it is going to be tricky.
Because each phase has its own challenges.
Exactly. Disagreements over the release of hostages.
Right.
Withdrawal of troops, the distribution of aid,
Any of that could derail the whole process.
any of it.
It feels like every step forward could be met with 2 steps back.
That's the reality of peace building in a conflict zone.
Yeah.
There are going to be setbacks.
Right.
There are going to be moments where it feels like everything is falling apart.
But we have to keep moving forward.
We do. The key is to keep moving forward.
Yeah.
Keep working towards that shared goal.
Of a peaceful future.
Exactly.
You mentioned the humanitarian crisis in Gaza earlier.
I did.
And I imagine that just adds another layer of complexity to all of this.
It absolutely does, even if the fighting stops.
Right.
The suffering continues.
Millions of people are displaced, living in desperate conditions.
It's true. Rebuilding their lives will take years.
Years.
Even decades.
And what about the psychological scars?
Right.
The trauma of living through this kind of intense conflict?
That's a wound that may never fully heal.
We need to recognize that healing from trauma takes time.
It does. It's a long-term process.
Yeah.
It requires support, understanding, and a sense of hope for the future.
This deep dive has been incredibly eye-opening.
It has.
This ceasefire is just one piece of a much larger puzzle.
And a puzzle with a lot of missing pieces.
Yeah.
Some pieces that don't quite fit together yet.
But we have to keep trying to solve it.
We do. The stakes are too high to give up on the possibility of peace.
Okay, so we've explored the background of the conflict,
Right.
the details of the ceasefire agreement, and all the challenges ahead.
We've covered a lot.
But before we wrap up,
Okay.
I want to kind of step back for a minute
Okay.
and ask you a more personal question.
Sure.
You've dedicated your career to understanding these kinds of conflicts.
I have.
What keeps you going?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
I think it's the human stories.
Okay.
Even in the midst of all the devastation,
Yeah.
you see this incredible resilience, compassion,
Right.
and a real yearning for peace.
Yeah.
I've met families in Gaza who've lost everything,
Wow.
yet they still hold on to hope for a better future.
It's powerful.
Those stories remind me that peace,
Yeah.
it's not just some political goal.
Right.
It's a human necessity.
It's easy to get lost in all the geopolitical maneuvering and forget that at the heart of this
Right.
are real people whose lives are being shattered.
Yeah.
But before we go, I want to leave our listener with something to think about.
Okay.
Imagine you were involved in these negotiations,
Right.
sitting across the table from the people you've been fighting. What would be your top priority?
Wow.
What would you focus on to make sure this ceasefire
Right.
isn't just a temporary pause, but a real turning point?
If I were in that room,
Yeah.
I would focus on building bridges,
Okay.
not just signing agreements.
So what would that look like?
I would push for initiatives that bring Israelis and Palestinians together face to face.
People who've lost loved ones in the conflict?
Exactly. People who've seen the horrors of war firsthand.
Yeah.
Let them share their stories, their pain, their hopes for the future. It's in those shared moments of humanity
Yeah.
that true understanding and empathy can begin to take root.
It's like that saying,
Yeah.
you can't hate someone whose story you know.
Exactly.
Maybe that's where real change starts.
Right.
Not at the negotiating table, but in those human connections.
I think you're right.
Well, this deep dive has been incredibly eye-opening.
It has.
It's clear the ceasefire is just one piece of a much larger puzzle.
A puzzle with a lot of missing pieces
Yeah.
and some pieces that don't quite fit together yet.
But we have to keep trying to solve it.
We do.
The stakes are too high to give up on the possibility of peace.
That's right.
Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
It was my pleasure.
This is just the beginning of the conversation, though.
Right.
So to our listeners, stay tuned.
And in the meantime,
Yeah,
keep thinking about that question.
absolutely.
What would you do to build lasting peace in this region?
It's a question worth pondering,
It is.
and it's one that we all have a stake in answering.
Absolutely. We all have a role to play.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning
And keep searching for those glimmers of hope.
in our complex world.
Exactly.